Welcome to Concept. Thank you for watching. We're going to talk today with you about your rights. You know what your rights are? I don't mean your individual rights only, but your legal rights in the government system that we have here in the United States. Our founding forefathers and founding foremothers who were part of the program but aren't given much attention really were concerned about the rights that the citizens had. After the formation of the Constitution, we had some amendments called the Bill of Rights. And we're going to take a look at these Bill of Rights now and see what they look like. The free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition. All of these are rights. These are several rights, all in one sentence. Second one, to keep and to bear arms. The protection from quartering troops. In other words, you couldn't be forced to house troops in your house and take care of them, give them a guest bedroom and a bathroom. You had the right to say no to the quartering of troops. The protection from unreasonable search and seizure. Due process. Double jeopardy. You couldn't be tried for the same crime twice. Self-incrimination and eminent domain. People couldn't just take over your land without asking you. They're called the privilege of eminent domain. These were some of the rights and some of the privileges that were very much a part of our government. Trial by jury. Speedy trials, public trials, and a right to counsel. Civil trial by jury. Prohibition of excessive bail, cruel and unusual punishment. Protection of rights not specifically enumerated, and powers of states. It's states' rights, in other words. That's what that's all about. And these are very important rights. These are the rights that all of us have. And these were part of the founding fathers' vision of what Americans needed to be protected from and for. And these are your rights and these are my rights. Now today we want to look at two ideas kind of juxtaposed. We want to look at your rights and we want to look at boundaries. Boundaries have directly to do with rights, and a lot of people, a lot of fathers and mothers, a lot of young people, a lot of children, employees and employers, wherever there's a relationship where other people are involved, we run the problem of not having clear boundaries and expectations. And when that happens, a lot of bad feelings and bad events can take place. Now, I have a long list of rights that I consider my rights, and I'm considering your rights too. And I brought along today just a short copy of that list because it's really not. I could spend the whole program dealing with this long list. It's well over 30 rights, but let me share with you some that I've picked out that I think really speak for us in the best way. Listen to me carefully and go through these and see how you do with these rights. You have the right to ask for what you want. How frustrating is it when somebody is talking to you and you wish they would tell you what they want? You say, would you please be clear to me? I'd like to know what you want, what you need. Tell me very clearly. You have a right to ask for what you want. You have the right to change your mind. Some people would like to hold you to a decision forever, but you have a right to change your mind. That's one of your rights as a human being. Another one of the rights that we have is you have the right to private space and time. And now that kind of goes along with the Bill of Rights that we just read to you from our Constitution. You have the right to private space and private time. That's a right that you have. We're going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes when we start talking about boundaries. Boundaries in families and boundaries at work and boundaries in marriages, all these kind of things. You have a right to private space and time. You have the right to say no when you're not ready. A little book came out years ago that I enjoyed very much, and it said, we need to learn to say yes and no quietly, carefully, quietly. Yes and no. Don't yell it. Just say yes and no, quietly. That's the way we deal with our colleagues and with our family members. Another interesting right that I think you'll enjoy thinking about with me is you have the right to be treated with dignity and respect. Now, we talk about this right. These are the civil rights. It's not just color involved, it's people involved. Civil rights is a lot more than school for uneducated people or poor people. Civil rights has to do with being civil to each other, of all races, of all countries, religions. You have the right to be treated, and I have the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And the last one I want to mention to you now, and there, as I say, this is from a long list that I took these from because there are a lot of others that I think would be very interesting for us to talk about. You have the right to be happy. You know, and we've talked about that on this program. Concept has a whole program on I'll be happy when. And the research is very interesting now dealing with happiness. Now, when we take the rights guaranteed in the Constitution, and we take the rights that we've talked about, your own personal rights, that leads us to another area which we call boundary keeping, boundary making. A very important concept for us to follow. Let's take a look now at what we mean by forming boundaries. How are boundaries formed? Well, the parenting style in your home influenced your boundaries and your boundary setting style. Now listen to me carefully. I am not saying that your parents are the problem with you and your boundaries. I'm simply saying that the parenting style of your mother and father had a lot to do with the way you set boundaries for yourself now, the way they set boundaries and curfews for you is, generally speaking, the way you're going to set boundaries in your families too. So our family matrix is an important place where we learn about boundaries and how boundaries are kept. And secondly, you deepen your boundary setting skills as your sense of personal treasuredness grows. I really like that phrase. Your sense of personal treasuredness grows. When we really value ourselves, we are a personal treasure, and our sense of personal treasuredness is real to us. Other people pick that up and understand how very special we are because we're very special to ourselves. You are special to yourself, and I'm special to myself, and we need to have that personal sense of treasuredness. This is very important at the beginning of this program. Now, we've kind of talked about what boundaries are. What are boundaries not? Now, listen to me very carefully, because a lot of people that I know and I see in my practice talk about boundaries all the time, and they end up being very selfish or very irresponsible or very arrogant or feeling superior or unwilling to help, or this is a big one, judgmental or brutally honest. I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Here's what I really think about you. That's not the kind of way that we set up boundaries. And boundaries should actually create an environment where things are going better. Albeit, sometimes you have to be firm. Take a situation at work. You're at work. During the lunch hour, you get together with the guys and they start telling jokes. And these jokes are a little blue, a little bit racial, and you're very uneasy. This is kind of a classic time to think about boundaries at work. You have several options. You can say to the group of men or women talking to you, you know, I'm uneasy with the way this conversation is going, with some of the things we're saying that are a little bit blue or a little bit racial. I'm uneasy with that, and I would prefer we didn't talk that way. Some people really don't have the nerve, nor do they feel the situation warrants it. So instead of that solution, they simply draw the boundary and they say, during the lunch hour, when this group gathers, I'm going to try to see to it that I'm not there. That's another way to set a boundary. Boundaries need to be set in very, very careful ways. The world has boundaries all over the place. A recipe is a boundary. The tide is a boundary. The tide comes and goes. The highest tide, or one of the highest tides in the world, is the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. I have read about the Bay of Fundy tide for years. And a few years ago, my wife and I took a road trip, and I said, honey, I would like to go and see the tide at the Bay of Fundy. This is one of the great boundaries, the tides and the Bay of Fundy tide, one of the great boundaries of the earth. And so I had the privilege of standing on the shore in the Bay of Fundy and watching one of the great boundary experiences of the world. I stood on that beach, and let me tell you, that tide comes in almost like a wave. I had to keep moving back. I went down as far as I could. It was low tide, and I just wanted to stay around. My wife said, you're kind of crazy, honey. Why do you want to stand around here and watch the tide come in? I said, I want to watch the tide come in at the Bay of Fundy. Here's one of the great boundaries of the world, the tide at the Bay of Fundy. And I could almost have to walk steady to stay ahead of that tide when it came in. We have all kinds of things in nature that help us understand what a boundary is. And by the way, a good boundary setter is never rude. We stay away from rudeness. That's not a good way to set up a boundary. If you want to deal with your family or your friends, you need to deal with them in a kind and acceptant way as you set boundaries, because most of them are not really used to the boundary setting that you do. Let's move on now and take another look at some of the things that help us understand what boundaries are and how we can respect boundaries. Boundaries dissolve a person's boundary setting skills by denying personal privacy. Denying personal privacy is an invasion of a very important boundary. Denying personal privacy, even to children, mom and dad, carefully look at. Teenagers and young adults are very, very conscious when you invade their boundaries. If they don't want to talk, if they don't want to show you, if they don't want to go there, carefully and politely back off. This is an important aspect when we talk about boundaries. Let's look at a couple more here that come on. Selecting only pet projects to praise. This is kind of an invasion of a boundary when mom and dad or the employer or the boss has certain pet projects and they push these all the time and ignore the concerns or the welfare or the whims or of their employees or the kids. In other words, be careful when you try to push your boundaries and your pet projects on people that might have some other projects that they want to spend time with. Well, let's take a look at a couple more now. Demanding an account for every action and punishing independent thinking. These are ways that we invade people's boundaries. Punishing independent thinking. You know, somebody said we spend the first 5 years of our kids' life teaching them how to walk and talk. And we spend the next 12 years in school saying, sit down and shut up. You know, we really need to be careful how we invade the boundaries of our kids in school and of our young adults in our home. Now, how can we actually carry on conversation without ignoring the bids for conversation? When children want to talk to us, when young adults want to talk to us, when our friends want to talk, when husbands and wives want to talk, it doesn't matter who, we want not to ignore these bids for conversation. One of America's great marriage and family therapists today talks about bids that husbands and wives give to each other. It's a bid for attention. Honey, listen to that. Listen, don't ignore those bids for conversation. They happen in the subtlest ways, and they happen all of the time, and we need to be careful that we don't ignore those subtle bid invitations for a conversation and for doing business together. And withholding trust. That's another way that we disrespect boundaries. You know, I really don't trust you. I guess I'm going to have to ask somebody else. I really don't understand what you mean. I don't really think I can trust you. This is a violation, again, of the process of setting, establishing, and respecting other people's and our own boundaries. Now, let's move on a little bit and take a look at what we can do to look at the threats, the real threats in our culture to building safe boundaries and safe fences. Threats to your own chosen boundaries consist of, number one, censure when you fail to meet expectations. Well, son, I'm really disappointed in you. I was expecting an A in that class, and you got a B. Ugh. Poor little guy kind of bows his head, and Dad is right there saying, you did not meet my expectations. You ought to feel awful. That's a violation of the boundaries, private boundaries that we have, and it happens all of the time. Take a look at another way. The intimidation, a nasty tactic of yelling and threatening. When the argument is weak, yell, threaten, your neck bulges and you're ready to threaten. When the argument is weak. Some people, we call them tanks. They kind of roll over other people, like a tank rolls over a tree or a bush or in a ravine. Just rolls over everybody. Total intimidation. Another one, withdrawal. A lot of men do this. Withdrawal. I'll freeze you out or disappear. You know, I don't really like what's going on here, sweetheart, so I'm out of here. I'm going to just silence myself. I'm going to quit talking, and I'm out of here. And I hope you feel awful. That's I'll freeze you out or I'll disappear. Okay, these are the ways. Flattery. Beware of phony baloney. That is another way that people flatter. Oh my goodness, and all of us can see it coming. You can see it coming, I can see it coming. And people start flattering you and you wonder, oh dear. What's going to happen next? What do they really want from me? These are ways that our boundaries are challenged. Fast-talking salesman. A salesman's no time for answers. You know, I can sell a refrigerator to Eskimos in the wintertime in Alaska. If I just keep talking and don't let them ask questions, I can invade their boundaries, just go right through their boundaries, and they won't even know what happened. Now, there's a way to protect ourselves from this, from harsh, nasty confrontation. There are ways to protect us from these ways that we challenge boundaries. The sympathy-getting ploys when the person needs to be helped, needs access or personal supply of something, sympathy. These can just kind of go across our mind. These poor people, what can we possibly do for them? How can we possibly help them? And so these are the kind of things that we want to do. Now, here we go with how we can protect our boundaries. How we can actually come together and help us establish boundaries. Listen to me carefully. This first part of our program deals with all the stuff that happens that breaks down our boundaries. Now we want to talk in closing about all the good things that happen that help us build up boundaries. Number one, determine what you will and you won't compromise. Set now, as I talk to you, there are things that you won't compromise. Now be careful, that list should not be very long, because you need some flexibility when you set up your boundaries. Recently I was talking with a mother and a daughter, and both of them thought the other one had boundary problems, when in fact both of them had boundary problems. And they weren't real clear about what a boundary was and what a compromise was. So I had to help them understand how important flexibility and compromise is when we talk about boundaries. Let's go to a second point that is very important. Determine which of your needs and wishes are legitimate. Are the boundaries that I have here real and legitimate? Am I going out of bounds with what I need to do? This is a very important question to ask. Is it my need and my wishes? Is it legitimate? Am I fair to ask this? Or is this something that I ought to be careful with and maybe talk with my friends, my husband, my wife, my employer or employee, get a little judgment, helpful judgment from other people about, is what I'm trying to set up as a boundary, is this legitimate? Another one is to communicate your preferences and needs and limits without whining, pouting, or yelling. This goes along with what I said boundaries are not earlier on in this program. Let's go back to that now and take a look at it, because it's got some interesting words in it that I want all of you to hear. Determine which of your needs and wishes are legitimate, and communicate your preferences and needs and limits. Number one, without whining. Number two, without pouting. And number three, without yelling. None of these have to do with what real boundaries are. And so that will help us as we try to set up our boundaries. And next, find a context where someone listens. If you have any questions, ask a question, ask help, ask somebody else what they think about what you say is a boundary for you, something you simply will not let somebody cross, you will not let them transgress. That's something that you want to keep very clear. And last, and very important, Endure conflict arising from boundary setting. Conflict from boundary setting will always happen. This is the way it is. Whenever you say, here is a line, and I'm not going to let you transgress it. I value myself. I value my integrity. I'm a treasured person. I have a sense of my own treasuredness. When that happens, it is impossible for somebody else to transgress onto your boundaries. That is the important part of this program. Yes, you have all kinds of rights, all kinds of rights. You are a treasured person, and boundaries help us in these ways. To build appropriate boundaries, determine what you will and you won't compromise. We've said that, Deborah. Which of your needs and wishes are legitimate? Communicate your preferences and your needs clearly. Clearly communicate your preferences and needs. Find a context where someone else listens and helps you process your boundaries. And last, endure conflict arising from boundary setting. Listen, when people are very clear, that you are very clear what is acceptable to you and what is not, and you're not trying to be aggressive and nasty about it, they will listen to you. They will respect you. They will look at you as you look at yourself, as a treasured person. I hope today, as we've looked at the Bill of Rights for all of the citizens of the United States, I hope as we've looked at our own Bill of Rights for us, just a few of our rights, and I hope as we've looked at boundaries, how important they are, what they're not, and how important it is for us to be flexible so that our boundaries don't become a fencing out people without cause or for all the wrong reasons. I hope that you have been impressed with how important it's going to be for you to be aware what your rights are, affirm those rights in every way possible, and to be aware of what your boundaries are, and to be very clear about how those boundaries are to be enforced in your presence. Remember what I'm saying. Don't try to be perfect, but do try to be better. Thank you for watching.